Think about this for a second. Right now, every single month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases a number, one single number. And that number can move trillions of dollars in global markets within seconds. It decides whether the Federal Reserve raises interest rates or cuts them. It shapes whether your mortgage goes up or down, whether your paycheck buys more or less at the grocery store, and whether politicians keep their jobs or lose them. That number is the Consumer Price Index, the official measure of inflation in the United States. But here's the part that almost nobody talks about. The United States did not have an official inflation rate until 1921. Let that sink in. For the first 145 years of the nation's existence, from the signing of the Constitution all the way through the Civil War, through the Gilded Age, through the rise of industrial titans like Rockefeller and Carnegie, through the creation of the Federal Reserve itself, America had no standardized government-published number that told its citizens how fast the prices of everyday goods were rising. And yet, prices rose, sometimes violently, sometimes so fast that a wagon load of currency could barely buy a wagon load of flour. People felt it in their stomachs, in their rent, in the shoes they couldn't afford for their children. They rioted over it. They fought wars over it. They elected presidents over it. They just couldn't put a number on it. So how did a nation navigate 145 years of economic turbulence, 2 major wars, multiple depressions, and the birth of modern capitalism without a tool that we now consider absolutely fundamental? How did anyone actually know that prices were rising? The answer to that question takes us on a journey through some of the most chaotic, desperate, and ingenious chapters of American economic history. And it reveals something unsettling about the world we live in today, because the tools we use to measure inflation are far younger and far more fragile than most people realize. Let us start at the very beginning. Before the United States even existed as a country, the colonists already had a problem with money. And more specifically, they had a problem with not having enough of it. In the 1700s, the American colonies operated in a monetary patchwork that would make a modern economist's head spin. British pounds, Spanish milled dollars, German thalers, and various colonial paper notes all circulated side by side. There was no central bank, no national mint, and certainly no standardized way to measure whether prices were going up or down. But people still knew. They knew because they could see it with their own eyes at the market stalls, at the docks, at the general stores that dotted the colonial landscape. When a bushel of wheat that cost 2 shillings last autumn suddenly cost 3 shillings this spring, you did not need an index to tell you something was wrong. You just needed a memory and a coin purse that was emptying faster than it should. The first real crisis of rising prices in what would become the United States arrived during the Revolutionary War, and it arrived with the force of a hurricane. When the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1775, they faced an impossible problem. They needed to fund a war against the most powerful military on earth, but they had no ability to levy taxes and almost no access to foreign credit. So they turned to the only option left. They started printing money. Between June of 1775 and November of 1779, the Continental Congress printed roughly $241 million in paper currency. These were the famous Continental dollars, and they were backed by nothing but the promise that the colonies would eventually redeem them in gold or silver once they won their independence. It was a massive gamble, and for a brief moment, it worked. The Continental dollars equipped the army, bought muskets and powder and boots, but Congress had not planned for a long war. The original timeline called for redeeming the Continentals beginning in 1779. And when it became clear by 1776 that this war was going to drag on far longer than anyone expected, confidence in the currency collapsed. Now, what happened next is one of the most dramatic episodes of inflation in the history of the Western world. By 1781, a continental dollar traded at a ratio of 1,000 to 1 against silver. A suit of clothes could cost 1,000,000 continentals. A barber in Philadelphia reportedly papered his shop walls with the bills because they were worth less than wallpaper. And a dog was paraded through the streets of another town, smeared in tar with continental notes stuck all over its body as a public joke about how worthless the money had become. The phrase that entered the American vocabulary and persists to this very day, "not worth a continental," was born during this catastrophe. But here is the remarkable thing. During this spiral of collapsing currency and soaring prices, there was no official measure of inflation anywhere. Nobody in the Continental Congress was publishing a monthly report on how much prices had risen. Nobody was tracking a basket of consumer goods and reporting a percentage change. The suffering was real, immediate, and obvious to everyone who lived through it, but it was unmeasured in any formal sense. And yet, out of this chaos came something extraordinary, something that most people have never heard of, and that economic historians consider a milestone in the history of finance. In 1780, as the war ground on and soldiers grew furious about the collapsing value of their pay, the Massachusetts legislature did something that had essentially never been done before in the recorded history of the world. They created a price index. It was crude.
It was improvised, but it was real.
A committee of the Massachusetts legislature selected 4 commodities: beef, corn, wool, and leather, and began tracking their average prices. They then used this index to adjust the pay of soldiers fighting in the Continental Army. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If the prices of these 4 basic goods went up, then the soldiers' pay would be adjusted upward to compensate. Between January of 1777 and January of 1780, this rudimentary index showed that prices had risen by roughly 33%. And so the soldiers' bonds were adjusted accordingly. This was, as far as historians can determine, one of the first instances in the world's history of what economists now call an inflation-indexed instrument. The legislature of Massachusetts had invented inflation-indexed bonds nearly 220 years before the United States Treasury would issue its first Treasury inflation-protected securities, known as TIPS, in 1997. And they did it without any formal economic theory to guide them. There were no textbooks on price indices. There was no academic literature on indexation. They were just desperate legislators trying to keep an army from deserting. But here is the tragedy of it. Once the immediate crisis passed, the concept was abandoned. The war ended. The continental dollar was eventually redeemed at a rate of 100 to 1, meaning a soldier holding a $1 note received 1 penny of new federal debt. And the ingenious idea of tracking prices to protect purchasing power was largely forgotten for over a century. After the Revolution, the framers of the Constitution were so traumatized by the continental dollar disaster that they wrote explicit protections against it into the founding document. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution forbade any state from issuing paper money or making anything other than gold and silver coin legal tender for the payment of debts. This clause was inserted with almost no debate during the Constitutional Convention, and it was cited approvingly by ratifying conventions in 9 states. The memory of a runaway inflation was still fresh, and the solution the founders chose was not to measure inflation better, but to prevent the conditions that caused it in the first place. For the next several decades, the United States operated under a system in which the dollar was tied to precious metals. First through the Coinage Act of 1792, which established the first national mint in Philadelphia. Under this system, the value of money was supposed to be inherently stable because every dollar was backed by a fixed amount of gold or silver. In theory, this meant inflation should not be a problem. In practice, it meant that price fluctuations were driven by the supply and demand of gold and silver, by trade balances, by crop failures, by banking panics, and by 100 other forces that no one fully understood. And people still felt those fluctuations keenly.
Farmers who had borrowed money to buy land would watch in horror as the prices of their crops fell while their debts stayed the same. Workers in the growing industrious cities of the Northeast would see their wages stagnate while the cost of food and fuel crept upward. But without any systematic measurement, these experiences remained anecdotal. Your neighbor might tell you that flour was more expensive this month. A newspaper might report that cotton prices had dropped in New Orleans. A merchant might complain that the cost of importing British textiles had risen. But there was no single number, no unified framework that could tell the nation as a whole where the prices were rising or falling and by how much. Then came the Civil War, and with it came the second great inflationary crisis in American history. By 1860, the United States was tearing itself apart, and just as in the Revolution, the fundamental problem was the same. How do you pay for a war when your treasury is nearly empty? The Union's answer arrived on February 25, 1862, when Congress passed the first Legal Tender Act, authorizing the printing of $150 million in treasury notes.
These were the famous greenbacks, named for the green ink used on their reverse side. Unlike the gold and silver coins that Americans were accustomed to, greenbacks were not backed by any precious metal. They were pure fiat currency, backed only by the government's promise to redeem them someday. Subsequent acts in July of 1862 and March of 1863 increased the amount of greenbacks in circulation to $450 million. The effect on prices was immediate and severe. Inflation in the Union States hit 14% in 1862 and climbed to 25% in 1863 and 1864. The value of a greenback fluctuated wildly in relation to the gold dollar, dropping as low as about 40 cents in early 1864 before recovering to near par by the war's end. Altogether, prices in the North roughly doubled during the war, an average inflation of about 80% over 4 years. But on the Confederate side, the situation was exponentially worse. The Confederacy, with even less ability to tax or borrow than the Union, resorted to printing money on a scale that made the greenbacks look restrained. By the end of 1862, Confederate Treasury notes totaled $500 million and were worth only a third of their face value in gold. By the end of 1863, the figure had climbed to over $700 million, and gold was quoted at 20 Confederate dollars for $1 in gold. By 1864, the ratio was 40-1. The Confederacy was drowning in its own paper, and once again, none of this was being measured by any official price index. There was no government agency tracking the cost of a basket of consumer goods. There was no monthly inflation report. The closest thing Americans had to a thermometer for rising prices was the gold market itself, where the fluctuating exchange rate between greenbacks and gold coins served as a rough proxy for how much purchasing power the paper money had lost. Newspapers published the daily gold price, and people watched it the way modern investors watch the S&P 500. When gold spiked, it meant confidence in the government's paper money was falling, and that prices would soon follow upward. When gold dropped, it offered a flicker of hope that the worst might be over. But the gold price was a blunt instrument. It told you about the overall confidence in the currency, not about the specific cost of feeding your family or heating your home. For that, Americans relied on the oldest inflation detection system known to humanity: lived experience. They tracked prices the way their grandparents had, through the daily grind of buying and selling, through conversations at the general store and the church pew, through the pain of watching their savings buy less and less with each passing month. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the question of what to do with the greenbacks became one of the most politically charged issues in America. Should the government continue circulating this fiat paper money, or should it return to a strict gold standard? The debate split the country along class and regional lines. Farmers and debtors in the South and West, who benefited from mild inflation because it made their debts easier to repay, wanted more greenbacks. Bankers and creditors in the Northeast, who were hurt by inflation because it eroded the value of the money owed to them, wanted the greenbacks withdrawn and the gold standard restored. This fight gave rise to an entire political movement. The Greenback Party, formally organized in the 1870s, argued that the government should keep printing paper money to help ordinary Americans. They were eventually absorbed into the broader populist movement, which championed the cause of silver coinage as another way to increase the money supply and push prices upward. The famous 1896 presidential campaign of William Jennings Bryan, with his immortal declaration that mankind should not be crucified upon a cross of gold, was in many ways the culmination of decades of arguments about inflation, deflation, and the value of money that had been raging since the Civil War. And through all of this, still no official inflation rate. The arguments were fierce, the stakes were enormous, but the combatants were fighting in the dark. They could feel inflation or deflation. They could point to specific prices that had risen or fallen, but they had no comprehensive, systematic measurement to anchor the debate in hard numbers. That began to change in 1891, and the catalyst was, of all things, a Senate resolution about tariffs.
On March 3, 1891, the last day of the last session of the 51st Congress, the United States Senate passed a resolution authorizing the Senate Committee on Finance to investigate the effects of tariff laws on imports, exports, and the prices of agricultural and manufactured goods. This may sound like dry legislative housekeeping, but it was the spark that ignited one of the most important statistical projects in American economic history. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, a powerful Republican who would later play a pivotal role in the creation of the Federal Reserve System, took charge of the investigation. He tasked the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which had been founded just 7 years earlier in 1884, with collecting actual price data from wholesale markets across the country. A committee headed by Dr. Roland Faulkner, a statistics professor from the University of Pennsylvania, was put in charge of the work. Over a 28-month period, beginning in mid-1889, the Bureau collected over 52,000 price quotations for 218 items purchased by wholesalers, who were commonly known as jobbers at the time. These prices were gathered from 7 major distribution centers across the country. The data were then compiled into the first wholesale price index, organized into 8 equally weighted groups of products. The results were published in Senator Aldrich's 1892 report, which showed that wholesale prices had fallen by just 0.3% between June of 1889 and September of 1891. A year later, in 1893, the Senate Committee and the Bureau completed an even more ambitious project, a massive compilation of historical wholesale prices stretching all the way back to 1840. It was the first effort of its kind in American history, and it was made possible only through the painstaking work of field economists and the cooperation of businesses willing to open their books. Now, it is worth pausing here to appreciate the significance of what had just happened. For the first time, the United States government had produced a systematic, data-driven measurement of how prices were changing over time. It was not a consumer price index. It did not measure the cost of living for ordinary families. It tracked wholesale prices, the costs that manufacturers and distributors charged each other. But it was a start. And it emerged not from some grand vision of economic governance, but from a narrow political question about whether tariffs were making goods more expensive. In 1900, the Bureau of Labor Statistics published its first standalone report, Wholesale Prices, 1890 to 1899, and by March of 1902, it began publishing the data annually. Each report included monthly price data going back to the base period of 1890, along with analysis of trends over time. The Wholesale Price Index had become a permanent feature of the American statistical landscape, but here is the critical gap that persisted for another 2 decades. The wholesale index tracked the prices that businesses charged each other. It did not track the prices that consumers actually paid at the grocery store, the butcher shop, the dry goods counter, or the coal dealer. And this mattered enormously because the prices that ordinary Americans cared about, the ones that determined whether they could feed their families and heat their homes, were retail prices, not wholesale prices. The difference between the two could be significant, distorted by middlemen, local market conditions, transportation costs, and the market practices of individual merchants. So even as the government began producing wholesale price data, ordinary Americans were still navigating price changes the old-fashioned way, through observation, word of mouth, and instinct. Housewives, who in this era did the vast majority of daily purchasing, were the nation's unofficial inflation monitors. They knew exactly what a pound of butter cost last month and what it cost today. They could tell you to the penny how much a dozen eggs had gone up. They tracked prices not in spreadsheets but in household budgets, scrolled in notebooks, or kept in their heads, refined through years of daily practice. And it was these women, these unsung economists of the kitchen table, who would eventually force the government to create a true consumer price index. Because when prices began spiraling out of control during the First World War, it was their fury that made the political class realize they could no longer govern the economy by feel. By the beginning of 1917, with the United States only weeks away from entering the Great War, grocery prices were surging at a pace that terrified working families. The cost of a simple dinner for a household had nearly quadrupled in some neighborhoods. On the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a resident told a New York Times reporter that it used to cost 49 cents to provide breakfast for a family of 4, but now the same breakfast would cost over $1, adding that eggs had become a luxury and potatoes were unaffordable. 2 pounds of onions cost 40 cents, 4 pounds of potatoes cost 28 cents, 2.5 pounds of meat cost 60 cents. These numbers may sound quaint today, but for a full-time worker earning roughly $40 a month, with perhaps $15 going to rent, these price increases were catastrophic. The frustration boiled over in February of 1917, when thousands of women poured into the streets of New York City in what became known as the food riots. Led by women from dozens of social, labor, and political organizations, the protesters confronted store owners and pushcart vendors, accusing them of price gouging. They stormed poultry markets, assaulted customers, and destroyed merchandise. In the first 6 months of 1917 alone, over 3,000 strikes erupted across the United States, many driven by the demand for higher wages to keep pace with soaring prices. This was the breaking point. The government could no longer pretend that the wholesale price index was sufficient for understanding what was happening to ordinary Americans. The wartime inflation was not an abstraction. It was a crisis that threatened social order. Prices rose at an annualized rate of 18.5% between December of 1916 and June of 1920, increasing more than 80% during that period. The government was pouring money into shipbuilding centers, expanding the military, and financing allies abroad. The monetary policy of the era was expansionary, and the Federal Reserve, which had only been created in 1913, was still too young and too politically constrained to act as an effective counterweight. In response to this crisis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics began collecting prices on a far more comprehensive basis. Starting in 1917, the Bureau expanded its data collection to cover 92 industrial cities across the country. Instead of just tracking wholesale prices, they now began collecting retail prices, the actual costs that consumers paid for food, clothing, fuel, and other necessities. In 1919, the Bureau began publishing semi-annual cost of living indexes for 32 cities, but these were still fragmentary city-level measures. They gave you a sense of how prices were changing in Cleveland or Pittsburgh or New York, but there was no single national number that could summarize the situation for the entire country. That final step came in February of 1921, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics published the first National Consumer Price Index, with estimates retroactively calculated back to 1913. Think about the timing of that for a moment. The CPI was born not out of calm deliberation or academic foresight, it was born out of crisis. It took a world war, food riots in the streets of America's largest city, thousands of labor strikes, and an inflation rate that peaked at nearly 24% in June of 1920 to force the government into creating the most basic tool of modern economic measurement. And even then, the first CPI was based on a survey of white wage earner families in 92 cities. It was narrow in scope, limited in coverage, and methodologically primitive by today's standards. But it existed. For the first time in American history, there was an official answer to the question, how fast are prices rising? The irony is almost poetic. The very first year the CPI was published as a regular national index, 1921, was a year of brutal deflation, not inflation. After the wartime price surge peaked in 1920, prices collapsed. The CPI dropped more than 20% between June of 1920 and September of 1922. Wholesale prices fell even more sharply. The recession of the early 1920s, sometimes called a depression in its own right, featured some of the most extreme deflation in American history. The 12-month decrease of 15.8% from June of 1920 to June of 1921 was larger than any 12-month decline recorded during the Great Depression that followed a decade later. So, the tool designed to measure rising prices arrived just in time to measure falling ones.
But it had arrived nonetheless, and once it existed, there was no going back. Now, let us step back and consider the full sweep of what we have just covered, because the implications are profound. For the first 145 years of the American Republic, the nation experienced at least three major inflationary crises: the continental dollar collapse of the 1770s, the Civil War greenback inflation of the 1860s, and the World War I price surge of 1916 through 1920, plus a prolonged and politically explosive deflation from 1873 to 1896. Each of these episodes reshaped American politics, destroyed fortunes, created new ones, and left deep scars on the national psyche. And during all of them, the government was essentially flying blind. People knew prices were rising. They could feel it, see it, measure it in their own household budgets. Newspapers reported on individual commodity prices. Gold markets served as rough proxies for currency depreciation. Politicians argued endlessly about the causes and cures, but there was no systematic, comprehensive, regularly published measurement that could tell the nation with any precision how much the cost of living had changed. The consequences of this blindness were enormous. Without reliable data, policy debates degenerated into shouting matches between competing anecdotes. Farmers in Kansas said prices were falling and crushing them under their debts. Bankers in New York said prices were stable and the farmers were exaggerating. Workers in Chicago said their wages were not keeping pace with the cost of food and fuel. Factory owners said the workers were ungrateful and lazy. Without a shared factual baseline, there was no way to resolve these disputes, and so they festered, feeding political extremism and social unrest. The populist movement of the 1890s, which nearly captured the presidency with William Jennings Bryan, was in many ways a product of this data vacuum. The farmers who formed the movement's base were experiencing real economic pain from falling crop and rising debt burdens. But because there was no authoritative measure of the overall price level, their claims were dismissed by Eastern elites as hysteria. If the wholesale price index, which was just beginning to be published during this period, had been available sooner and had covered consumer prices, it might have provided the empirical ammunition needed to win policy changes before the political situation became so volatile. Similarly, the labor unrest of the World War I era, the strikes, the riots, the political radicalism, was intensified by the absence of reliable cost of living data. Workers knew they were being squeezed. Employers denied it. The government had no neutral arbiter to consult. The creation of the CPI was, in this light, not just a statistical achievement, but a political necessity. It gave the nation a shared language for talking about economic reality, a common reference point that could anchor negotiations between labor and management, inform government policy, and hold politicians accountable. But there is a darker side to the story as well, and it is one that resonates powerfully in the present day. The CPI, for all its importance, is a human creation. It is built on choices about which goods and services to include in the basket, how to weight them, how to account for changes in quality, how to handle new products that did not exist when the index was designed. These choices are not neutral. They reflect assumptions about how people live, what they consume, and what matters most to their economic well-being. And those assumptions can be, and have been, manipulated. Since its creation, the CPI has been comprehensively revised on multiple occasions. Each revision has changed the way inflation is measured, sometimes in ways that made the reported number higher, sometimes in ways that made it lower. Critics have argued for decades that methodological changes introduced in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly the use of so-called hedonic adjustments and substitution effects, have systematically understated inflation, making the official number look lower than the price increases that ordinary Americans actually experience. Whether you agree with that critique or not, the point is that the measurement of inflation is not a settled science. It is a living, evolving, politically contested process that has only existed for a little over a century. And before that century of measurement, there were 145 years of economic life that had to be navigated without it. Those years remind us that the tools we take for granted today are remarkably recent inventions. They were forged in moments of crisis, shaped by political pressures, and remain imperfect even now.
The American colonists who watched continental dollars become wallpaper, the Civil War workers who saw greenbacks erode their wages, the Lower East Side housewives who stormed the poultry markets of Manhattan in 1917. All of them were living through the same fundamental economic phenomenon that the CPI now purports to measure with precision. They just had to feel their way through it in the dark. There is one more thread to pull here, and it connects this entire history to the world we inhabit right now. Before the CPI existed, there was a deeper, more ancient system for understanding the value of money, and that was the gold standard. For most of American history, the dollar was defined in terms of a fixed weight of gold or silver. This meant that in theory, the price level should be anchored by the supply of precious metals. When gold was plentiful, prices tended to rise. When gold was scarce, prices tended to fall. The gold standard was not perfect. It produced its own brutal cycles of inflation and deflation, but it provided a kind of automatic discipline. The government could not simply print its way out of a fiscal crisis because every dollar was supposed to be convertible into a fixed amount of metal.
The abandonment of the gold standard, which happened in stages throughout the 20th century and was completed by President Nixon in 1971, removed that anchor entirely. Today, the dollar is backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States government, which is another way of saying it is backed by the government's ability to tax, to borrow, and to manage its monetary policy wisely. In this world of pure fiat currency, the CPI is not just a statistical convenience, it is the only thing standing between the public and total ignorance about what their money is actually worth. Without the CPI or something like it, the government could inflate the currency quietly, invisibly, without anyone being able to prove it with hard data. Social security payments, which are adjusted annually based on the CPI, would have no rational basis for adjustment. Wage negotiations between labor and management would devolve into the same kind of anecdotal shouting matches that characterized the 19th century. And the Federal Reserve, which uses inflation data as one of its primary guides for setting interest rates, would be flying blind, just as the government flew blind for the first century and a half of the Republic's existence. The history of inflation measurement in America is, in this sense, a story about power, about who gets to define economic reality, about how long it takes for governments to develop even the most basic tools of accountability, and about how much suffering occurs in the gap between when a problem becomes urgent and when the tools to address it finally arrive. It took a war for independence, a civil war, a world war, and countless episodes of human misery to produce a single monthly number that most Americans glance at and forget. But that number, imperfect as it is, represents something hard-won. A commitment to measuring reality rather than guessing at it, a recognition that in a democracy, the people deserve to know what their money is worth. The next time you see a headline about the latest CPI report, remember that for most of American history, that headline would have been impossible. And remember the people who lived through the inflationary storms without it, who tracked prices in notebooks and market stalls and kitchen tables, who built the first crude index out of beef and corn and wool and leather, who rioted in the streets when their government failed to recognize what they already knew in their bones. Prices were rising. They always knew. They just had no way to prove it. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, and if you want to keep exploring the hidden forces that shape the economies we all live in, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Drop a like on this one if it gave you a new way of thinking about something as simple as the price of groceries,